My daughter-in-law's poisonous words cut deep. "You pathetic old man." But when my daughter-in-law's hand struck my cheek, my patience turned to anger. At that moment, a line had been crossed, and I vowed she would pay the price. What happened next made her cry. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you are listening in the comments. The ceramic mug hit the counter with a sharp crack. Linda's bare feet slapped against the kitchen tiles, each step more aggressive than the last. I didn't look up from my newspaper, but I could feel her anger radiating across the room like heat from an open oven. Again? Her voice cut through the morning silence. "Again you drank all the coffee? Typical for you, only thinking about yourself." The coffee pot sat empty on the counter, accusing me silently. I had made it at 6:30, same as every morning for the past 3 years. Same routine, same kitchen, same growing tension that seemed to thicken with each passing week. I folded the sports section carefully, keeping my movements deliberate and calm. Years of marriage to Margaret had taught me that quick motions only escalated conflict. Margaret? She would have made a second pot without complaint, probably humming while she did it. "I can go to the store," I offered, setting down the paper. "Buy more coffee. Won't take but 20 minutes. Linda whirled around, her robe flaring dramatically. Sleep had left her hair wild, but her eyes were sharp with familiar resentment. "Don't need your charity, you pathetic old man." The words landed like a physical blow. I felt my hand instinctively rise toward my cheek, as if she had actually slapped me. The morning sunlight streaming through the bay windows suddenly seemed too bright, too cheerful for this moment. She yanked open the cabinet doors, slamming them shut when they revealed nothing useful. The sound echoed through the Victorian kitchen that Margaret and I had renovated 20 years ago. Back then, this room had been filled with laughter, with the smell of Sunday pancakes and the comfortable chatter of a happy marriage. "Selfish," Linda muttered, loud enough for me to hear. "Always selfish." I remained seated, my coffee growing cold in the mug Margaret had given me for our 35th anniversary. The newspaper lay forgotten, headlines about spring training and city council meetings suddenly irrelevant. My reading glasses had slipped down my nose, but I didn't adjust them. Moving seemed dangerous right now. Linda grabbed her empty cup and threw it into the sink with unnecessary force. The clatter made me wince. She stood there for a moment, shoulders rigid, breathing hard like she had just run a marathon instead of simply walking downstairs for coffee. The refrigerator hummed. The old house settled with its familiar creaks. Somewhere outside, a neighbor's dog barked twice and fell silent. Normal morning sounds that felt surreal in the charged atmosphere of my kitchen. "Percy!" Linda's voice carried toward the living room. "Percy, get in here." But Percy wasn't home yet. I knew because I had heard his key turn in the lock just as Linda started her tirade. He always jogged Monday mornings, always returned around 8:15, always came through the front door carrying his phone and earbuds, slightly out of breath but energized. Linda stormed toward the doorway, her robe billowing behind her like some angry ghost. I sat perfectly still, touching my cheek where her words had stung, and waited for my son to choose sides. Again. The front door opened with its familiar squeak. Percy's keys jingled against the wooden entry table, followed by the soft thud of his running shoes being kicked off. I could hear him breathing hard from his morning jog, the sound carrying through the hallway to where I still sat in the kitchen. "Linda?" His voice held immediate concern. "What's wrong?" She had positioned herself perfectly in the living room doorway, one hand braced against the frame, the other clutching her robe closed at the throat. When Percy appeared, still wearing his gray jogging shorts and Chicago Marathon t-shirt, earbuds dangling around his neck, Linda's entire demeanor shifted. The angry woman who had called me pathetic 30 seconds earlier transformed into something softer, more vulnerable. Her shoulders sagged just enough to suggest defeat without appearing dramatic. Her voice, when it came, carried the perfect note of wounded dignity. "Your father showed his selfishness again." Percy's face immediately clouded with disappointment. Not surprise, disappointment. As if he had been expecting this exact scenario, this exact outcome. He moved toward Linda automatically, his protective instincts engaging without question or investigation. "Dad?" Percy looked toward the kitchen where I remained seated. "What happened?" I could see them both from my chair at the table. Linda had maneuvered herself so Percy stood between us, her hand now resting lightly on his forearm. She gazed up at him with eyes that suggested deep hurt rather than the fury she had displayed moments before. "The coffee," Linda said quietly. "He drank it all, again. Never thinks about anyone else in this house." Percy's shoulders tensed. His jogging clothes were still damp with sweat, his dark hair matted against his forehead. But his attention was completely focused on Linda's carefully crafted narrative. He didn't ask for my version. Didn't wonder why I might have made coffee at 6:30 for one person when Linda never woke before 8. "Dad," Percy said, his voice carrying that familiar tone of parental disappointment. "Maybe you should have thought about others." The role reversal stung more than Linda's insult. My 45-year-old son speaking to me like I was the child, like I needed correction and guidance. Linda's small smile of satisfaction was visible only to me, hidden from Percy by her perfectly angled position. I stood slowly, my joints protesting after sitting too long at the hard kitchen chair. The newspaper remained scattered across the table, abandoned headlines about spring weather and local politics. Margaret's coffee mug sat empty, a small pool of cold coffee marking the bottom. "Yes," I said quietly. "Of course. Sorry." The word tasted bitter, not because I minded apologizing when I was wrong, but because I wasn't wrong. Because this had nothing to do with coffee and everything to do with power, with blame, with the careful ecosystem of resentment that had grown in my house over 3 years. Percy's arm went around Linda's shoulders, pulling her close in a gesture both protective and possessive. She leaned into him gratefully, the perfect picture of a woman supported by her devoted husband. Her eyes found mine over Percy's shoulder, and for just a moment I saw triumph there. "It's okay, honey," Percy murmured into Linda's hair. "Dad didn't mean anything by it, right, Dad?" I nodded, because what else could I do? Fight a battle I had already lost? Explain that Linda's version was carefully edited, strategically presented? My son had made his choice years ago, and it wasn't me. The morning sun had shifted, no longer streaming directly through the windows. The kitchen felt darker now, shadows lengthening across the floor. I had mopped yesterday after Linda complained about sticky spots near the refrigerator. I walked toward my study, leaving Percy and Linda in their tableau of mutual support. My footsteps sounded hollow on the hardwood floor, each step taking me further from the warmth of the living room and deeper into the quiet corners of my own house. Behind me, I heard Linda's voice, soft and grateful. "Thank you for understanding, sweetheart." But I was already gone. The study door closed behind me with a gentle click. 9 o'clock had come and gone, while I sat in my leather chair, watching shadows creep across the bookshelves. Percy and Linda had spent the afternoon shopping, their laughter echoing through the house when they returned with bags from the mall. I had worked in my garden until my back ached, then retreated here when the evening news began playing too loudly in the living room. This room held 40 years of my life. Engineering textbooks lined the shelves, their spines cracked from decades of reference. Awards from the firm gathered dust on the windowsill. Margaret's reading glasses still lay on the desk, where she had left them 3 years ago. The day before the stroke that took her away from me and left me vulnerable to everything that came after. I picked up the glasses, feeling their familiar weight. Margaret had worn them to read mystery novels, curled up in the chair that Linda now claimed in the living room. She would have handled this morning differently. Margaret never let anyone treat me like a child, never allowed disrespect to masquerade as concern. "Emmett," she had said once, when my brother criticized my decision to take early retirement, "you don't owe anyone an explanation for living your life on your terms." She had stood behind my chair at that family dinner, her hand on my shoulder, her voice carrying absolute conviction. "You've earned the right to make your own choices." That was Margaret, fierce when she needed to be, protective without being manipulative, the opposite of what lived in my house now. 3 years ago, Percy and Linda had lost their house in Naperville. Some combination of overspending and bad investments, job troubles, and credit card debt. The details had been vague, but their desperation was clear. They had nowhere else to go, Percy had said, standing in this same study with Linda, crying quietly behind him. "Just until we get back on our feet, Dad. 6 months, maybe 8. We'll pay rent, help with utilities." Linda's great with organization. She could help you get Mom's things sorted. I had said yes immediately. What else could I do? My son needed help, and I had this big empty house full of memories and silence. Margaret would have wanted me to help family. She would have opened our door without hesitation. But Linda never helped sort Margaret's things. Instead, she moved them, slowly, subtly, replacing my wife's presence with her own. The coffee table books Margaret loved disappeared, replaced by Linda's fashion magazines. The gentle lavender candles Margaret favored gave way to aggressive vanilla scents that made my eyes water. 6 months became a year became 3. Rent payments stopped after the first few months, explained away by Linda's vague health issues and Percy's temporary setbacks. I never pushed because pushing felt cruel, felt like admitting that my generosity had limits. But everything has limits. I set Margaret's glasses down carefully and reached for the photo album she had been working on before she died. Our trip to Ireland in 2019, the vacation she had planned for months. Her handwriting filled the margins. Emmett at the cliffs of Moher, trying to look brave. Our B&B in Galway, note the tiny shower. She had seen the best in everything, found joy in moments that would have frustrated others. The delayed flights, the cold rain, the bed that was too soft. None of it mattered to Margaret. She had been grateful for the adventure, grateful for the time together. When had I stopped seeing life through Margaret's eyes? When had I begun accepting blame instead of standing up for truth? The man in these photos looked confident, happy, loved. The man who apologized for drinking coffee in his own house looked defeated. The realization hit me like cold water. This morning wasn't an isolated incident. It was Tuesday's argument about the thermostat, when Linda accused me of wasting money on heat. Wednesday's complaint about my choice of television programs, delivered as concern for my declining mind. Last week's criticism of how I loaded the dishwasher, presented as helpful instruction. Death by 1,000 cuts. Each incident small enough to seem petty if I complained, but together they formed a pattern designed to make me question my own judgment, my own worth. The house was quiet now, except for the distant murmur of the television. Through the study window, I could see Mrs. Patterson's kitchen light across the street, warm and welcoming. A normal house where people probably treated each other with basic respect. I turned toward the old rotary phone on my desk, the one Margaret had insisted we keep because she loved its solid weight and reliable connection. Rufus Gardner's number was written in Margaret's neat script on a card taped to the base. My old college roommate, now living in Miami Beach, had been calling for months trying to convince me to visit. "Come down for a few weeks, Emmett," he had said during our last conversation. "Get some sun. Remember what it feels like to be around people who actually like you." At the time, I had laughed off his comment about people liking me, but now, sitting in the growing darkness of my study, his words felt less like a joke and more like a diagnosis. My hand hovered over the phone. One call could change everything. One conversation might open a door that had been closed for 3 years. Outside, a car passed slowly down the street, its headlights briefly illuminating the framed photo of Margaret and me on our wedding day. She was smiling at the camera, but I was looking at her, my face full of hope for the future we would build together. That man had known his own worth. Maybe it was time to remember what that felt like. Morning light filtered through the dining room windows as I sat with my coffee and tablet, reading the weather forecast for Miami Beach. 78 degrees and sunny. The contrast with Chicago's gray March couldn't have been more appealing. Percy appeared in the kitchen doorway, already dressed for work, his tie hanging loose around his neck. He scrolled through emails on his phone while reaching for the coffee pot with his free hand. The same morning routine we'd all fallen into over 3 years. "Big day at the office?" I asked, keeping my tone casual. "Client presentation." Percy poured coffee without looking up. "Should be straightforward." Linda swept into the kitchen wearing her silk robe, the one she'd bought with money that used to be mine. Her movements carried a confidence I hadn't noticed before yesterday morning. She hummed softly while opening cabinets, arranging her domain with the satisfaction of someone who had won a territorial dispute. "Sleep well?" she asked, but not really asking. Her tone suggested she already knew the answer and didn't particularly care. I set down my tablet and watched both of them navigate around each other in the space that Margaret and I had once shared. Percy checking his phone, Linda organizing coffee cups, neither paying much attention to me. Perfect. "I'm going to Rufus's place in Florida for a week," I announced. Percy's thumb stopped scrolling. Linda's humming ceased abruptly. The morning sounds, coffee brewing, refrigerator humming, distant traffic, suddenly seemed amplified in the silence. "Florida?" Percy looked up from his phone for the first time since entering the kitchen. When? Today. Flight leaves at noon. Linda turned from the counter, and for a moment her mask slipped completely. Pure, undiluted joy spread across her face before she could catch herself. Her shoulders relaxed, her smile became genuine, and she moved with sudden lightness toward the kitchen island. Finally! The word escaped before she could stop it. I can feel like the real mistress of this house. Percy frowned, sensing something wrong in her obvious delight. Linda... What? She laughed, a sound I hadn't heard in months. It's wonderful. Your father needs a vacation, and I need space to really organize things properly. She gestured expansively around the kitchen. You know how he likes everything just so. I did know. I like my morning newspaper folded properly, my coffee made strong, my few possessions left where I put them. Apparently, these preferences had become character flaws worthy of celebration when removed. Percy's discomfort grew visible. He glanced between Linda's animated excitement and my careful calm, his peacemaking instincts engaging. Dad, maybe it's better if we all discuss this first. I mean, sudden trips. No, it's a wonderful idea, Linda interrupted, moving to stand beside Percy, her hand finding his arm. Emmett, you'll love Miami Beach. The sunshine will do you good. She spoke my name with the tone people use for elderly relatives there, humoring, fond but distant, as if I were already half gone, and this trip might help finish the job. I finished my coffee slowly, observing their positioning. Linda had naturally placed herself between Percy and me, her body language claiming ownership of the space, of the conversation, of my son's attention. Percy stood uncertainly, his loyalty divided, but his choice already made by habit. Rufus has been asking me to visit for months, I said. Seemed like good timing. Perfect timing, Linda agreed enthusiastically. Spring cleaning season, you know? I can finally get this place properly organized without worrying about disturbing anyone. The words hung in the air like a confession. Without worrying about disturbing anyone. As if my presence in my own home was something to work around. An obstacle to her true desires. Percy checked his watch and grabbed his coffee cup. I should get going. He kissed Linda's cheek, then looked at me with that familiar expression of mild concern. Have a good trip, Dad. Call when you get there? Of course. Linda practically glowed as she watched Percy gather his briefcase and head for the front door. The moment his car pulled out of the driveway, she began moving through the kitchen with renewed energy, already planning changes she could make in my absence. I rose from the table, leaving my empty cup and tablet behind. I should pack. Take your time, Linda called after me, but she was already opening drawers, pulling out cleaning supplies with the enthusiasm of someone finally free to claim their territory. As I walked toward my study, I could hear her humming again, the same tune she'd started with, but now carried with genuine happiness. The sound followed me down the hallway, a soundtrack to my newfound clarity about what I meant to the people living in my house. Evening shadows stretched across my study as I opened the leather suitcase that had belonged to my father. Its brass latches clicked with the same solid sound I remembered from childhood trips to visit relatives who actually wanted us there. The irony wasn't lost on me. Folding shirts into neat stacks, I let my mind wander to the conversation I'd had with Rufus 2 nights ago. His voice had carried across the phone line with characteristic directness. Emmy, you sound like a man who needs to remember what it feels like to be valued. The distant sound of television laughter drifted from the living room. Linda and Percy were watching their evening programs, probably sharing popcorn and commentary about their day. The perfect picture of domestic contentment, requiring only my absence to be complete. I reached for the photograph on my desk, Margaret and me on our honeymoon in Niagara Falls, both of us squinting into the camera with ridiculous grins. She had insisted we take the tacky tourist shot, and I had grumbled about the expense. Now, I'd give anything to have her grumbling back at me about something equally trivial. 3 years ago, when Percy and Linda had appeared in this same study with tear-stained faces and a folder full of overdue notices, I had written that check without hesitation. $47,000. The exact amount needed to clear their debts and give them a fresh start. I could still feel the weight of the checkbook in my hands, still hear Linda's grateful sobs. We'll pay you back, Percy had promised, his pride wounded, but his relief palpable. Every penny, Dad, with interest. Linda had nodded through her tears. You're saving our lives, Emmett. We'll never forget this. But they had forgotten. Not maliciously, perhaps, but completely. The promised rent payments had lasted 3 months before Linda's mysterious health issues made them impossible. The grocery contributions had dwindled to nothing when Percy's temporary work situation stretched indefinitely. My generosity had transformed from emergency assistance to expected service. I folded a pair of khakis and remembered Linda's appendicitis scare 18 months ago. The midnight drive to the emergency room, her hand clutching mine in the waiting room, my credit card covering the deductible without question. She had been genuinely grateful then, calling me Dad for the first time, promising to be the daughter Margaret had never given me. That version of Linda had lasted exactly as long as her recovery period. The house settling around me creaked with familiar sounds, but tonight they felt different, less like home, more like a building where I happened to sleep. When had that changed? When had I become a guest in rooms I had painted, paying utilities for appliances I had purchased, apologizing for drinking coffee I had made? I lifted Margaret's reading glasses from the desk, turning them over in my hands. She had been fierce about boundaries, gentle but absolutely clear about what she would and wouldn't accept. Kindness without limits becomes exploitation, Emmett, she had once said about her sister's endless requests for money. Love doesn't mean becoming a doormat. Margaret had died before Percy's financial crisis, before Linda's careful erosion of my authority began. But I could imagine her reaction to this morning's breakfast scene, to Linda's unconcealed joy at my departure. Margaret would have had words, quiet words, but devastating in their precision. Through the study window, I could see the Patterson house across the street, warm light glowing from their kitchen. A normal home where people probably said please and thank you, and meant both. Where visiting was invited, not endured. I closed the suitcase and listened to the latches click shut. Tomorrow I would sit in Rufus's backyard, watching pelicans dive for fish, and remembering what it felt like to be around someone who actually enjoyed my company. Someone who asked my opinion and waited for the answer. Someone who saw me as a person rather than a resource. The laughter from the living room had died down to comfortable murmuring. Percy and Linda discussing their day, planning their evening, existing in their bubble of mutual contentment. They wouldn't miss me at breakfast tomorrow, wouldn't wonder how my flight went, wouldn't think about me at all unless something needed fixing or paying for. I turned off the desk lamp and sat in darkness, feeling the weight of my father's suitcase beside me, ready for tomorrow's departure, ready for a week of remembering who I used to be before I became convenient. The house was quiet now, except for the whisper of central heating and the distant hum of the television. Normal sounds of a normal evening in what used to be a normal home before I learned the difference between being needed and being used. The Florida sun had burned away 3 years of Chicago tension from my shoulders. 6 days into my stay with Rufus, I found myself moving differently, straighter, more purposeful, like a man who didn't need to apologize for taking up space. Rufus's cottage sat 50 yards from the water, weathered cedar shingles and hurricane shutters that had survived decades of Gulf storms. Nothing fancy, but solid and comfortable, like the friendship that had brought me here. We had fallen into an easy rhythm, coffee at sunrise, fishing until noon, afternoon rest, evening conversations on the screened porch. "You're looking more like yourself, Emmy." Rufus adjusted his fishing line, the motion practiced and automatic. 20 years of Florida retirement had turned him brown as a coconut, his white hair perpetually tousled by ocean breeze. The Gulf stretched endlessly before us, morning light turning the water silver green. I cast my line and felt something loosen in my chest that I hadn't realized was tight. I'd forgotten what quiet feels like. Quiet's good, but it ain't everything. Rufus glanced at me sideways. "You ready to talk about why you really came down here?" 3 days of easy companionship had built to this moment. I had been waiting for Rufus to ask directly, and he had been patient enough to let me settle in first. Old friends understood timing. "Percy and Linda," I said simply. "Figured. You mentioned them exactly twice all week, both times like you were describing strangers." Rufus reeled in his empty hook and rebaited with methodical precision. "That's not how a man talks about family he's happy with." A pelican dove near our lines, emerging with a fish that flashed silver in its beak. Natural order, predator and prey, no apologies necessary. They needed help 3 years ago, lost their house, mountains of debt. "So you helped. Course you did." Rufus's tone held no judgment, just recognition of character. But helping and being used ain't the same thing. The words hit like a physical impact. I had been dancing around that exact truth for months, afraid to name it directly. It's family, Rufus. Emmy. His voice carried the authority of someone who had earned the right to speak hard truths. I got 3 kids and 5 grandchildren. Love 'em all. But 2 of those kids learned that Daddy's wallet wasn't bottomless, and one never did. Guess which one still calls me just to chat? I knew Rufus's family history, the successful daughter in Atlanta, the son who'd found his footing in construction, and the youngest boy whose addiction had drained the family for years before Rufus finally said no. Sometimes love means setting limits, Rufus continued. Sometimes it means making people uncomfortable enough to grow up. My phone buzzed with a text, Percy. Hope you're having fun. When should we expect you back? Not, we miss you, or can't wait to see you. Just logistics, like confirming a delivery date. I showed the message to Rufus, who read it and shook his head. When's the last time that boy asked how you were feeling, instead of when you'd be available? The question hung between us like humidity. I tried to remember and couldn't. Percy's calls were about practical matters. What time he'd be home, whether I needed anything from the store, reminders about appointments, efficient communication between people sharing space, not conversations between father and son. Margaret used to say I was too soft, I admitted, that I'd rather be taken advantage of than risk hurting someone's feelings. Margaret was a smart woman, smarter than both of us. Rufus had known my wife for 40 years, had watched her manage my overgenerosity with gentle firmness. She'd be kicking your tail right about now. The truth of that made me smile for the first time in days. Margaret would indeed be furious, not at Percy and Linda for their behavior, but at me for allowing it. She had 0 patience for doormat behavior, even from people she loved. So, what are you going to do about it? Rufus asked. The sun climbed higher, burning off morning clouds and revealing the day's brilliant blue potential. Somewhere in Chicago, Linda was probably rearranging my kitchen cabinets, and Percy was pretending not to notice his father's absence. They were comfortable, settled, secure in the knowledge that their safety net would return on schedule. I'm going to show some backbone, I said finally. Rufus's weathered face broke into a grin. About time. Your daddy didn't raise a pushover, even if you've been playing one lately. A fish tugged at my line, and I set the hook with more force than necessary. Whatever I caught today, I was keeping. 30,000 feet above Illinois, I pressed my face to the airplane's small window and watched Chicago's sprawl emerge from the afternoon haze. 7 days in Florida had bronzed my skin and clarified my thinking in ways I hadn't anticipated. Rufus's parting words echoed in my ears. Emmy, you're not going home to be the same man who left. Remember that. The flight attendant collected my empty coffee cup with a professional smile. Around me, other passengers prepared for landing. Business travelers checking phones, families gathering scattered belongings, everyone eager to return to whatever waited below. I felt no such eagerness, only a calm resolve that had been building since yesterday morning's fishing expedition. My phone showed the family chat messages I'd sent over the week. March 19th. Arrived safely in Miami. Will call later. March 24th. Flight tomorrow. AA 1247 arrives O'Hare 6:45 p.m. Can someone pick me up? Both messages displayed that small red indicator beneath them. Timestamps showing Percy and Linda had seen them 12 hours ago. No responses. 3 years ago, that silence would have hurt. Today it simply confirmed what Rufus had helped me understand. I had become convenient rather than valued, useful rather than loved. The airplane touched down with a gentle bump, and passengers began the familiar ritual of retrieving overhead baggage. I waited patiently as the aisle filled with hurried travelers, my father's leather suitcase still secured above me. No rush anymore. No one was waiting. O'Hare's terminal buzzed with the usual controlled chaos of evening arrivals. Families reunited with tearful embraces. Business colleagues shook hands. Couples kissed with the enthusiasm of separation ended. I walked past these scenes of welcome and headed toward the taxi stand, my suitcase wheels rolling steadily behind me. Where to? The taxi driver was a weathered man about my age, Chicago accent thick as lake ice. I gave him my address and settled back against the worn vinyl seat. Through the windshield, the city's familiar skyline looked unchanged, but I felt like I was seeing it through different eyes. Clearer eyes, less forgiving eyes. "Family vacation?" the driver asked, glancing at my slight tan in his rearview mirror. "Visiting an old friend? Family was supposed to pick me up." The words came out easier than I'd expected, without the usual apologetic edge I'd developed when explaining away other people's inconsideration. "Ah, happens more than you'd think. Sometimes family takes us for granted." He merged into evening traffic with practiced ease. "Been driving 23 years, heard every variation of that story." 7 years I've been too understanding about that," I said, surprising myself with the admission. The driver nodded knowingly. "Understanding's good until it becomes doormat behavior. Then you gotta draw some lines." Margaret used to say something similar. The memory of her voice, sharp with protective anger, when someone tried to take advantage of my generous nature, warmed me more than the Florida sun had. She would have approved of my week with Rufus, would have encouraged the changes I felt, crystallizing in my chest. Traffic slowed as we entered my neighborhood, familiar houses passing in the gathering dusk. Mrs. Patterson's kitchen light glowed warmly across from my place, same as always. But as we turned onto my street, something looked different. Cars lined both sides of the road, where usually only a few residents parked. My driveway held vehicles I didn't recognize, and lights blazed from windows throughout my house. Even from a block away, I could hear the bass thump of music that definitely wasn't my preferred jazz station. "Looks like someone's having a party," the driver observed. I leaned forward, counting unfamiliar license plates. "Looks like." The taxi pulled to the curb in front of my house, and I could see figures moving past the living room windows, strangers in my space, using my furniture, treating my home like their entertainment venue. The week's transformation completed itself in that moment of recognition. I handed the driver his fare, plus a generous tip. "Thanks for the conversation. Good luck with whatever's waiting in there," he said, genuine concern in his voice. As his taillights disappeared down the street, I stood on my own sidewalk with my suitcase and listened to laughter spilling from my house into the quiet neighborhood evening. 7 days ago, I might have hesitated, might have worried about causing a scene or embarrassing my family. Tonight, I simply straightened my shoulders and walked toward my front door. The familiar weight of my house key felt strange in my palm as I approached the front porch. Beer bottles clustered around my wicker furniture, like unwelcome guests at a funeral, their labels catching the porch light I'd left on automatic timer. The music grew louder with each step, some contemporary pop that Margaret would have turned off within seconds. Through my living room window, I could see the chaos clearly now. Strangers sprawled across the sofa Margaret and I had chosen together for our 30th anniversary. Someone had moved my coffee table to accommodate more seating, and my carefully arranged bookshelf had been disturbed to make space for party supplies. Food containers covered every surface, and plastic cups littered the hardwood floors I'd refinished just last summer. A woman I'd never seen before stood beside my stereo system, laughing at something a bearded man was saying while she rifled through my record collection. My records, Margaret's records, albums we'd bought together, danced to, argued about, treasured through 40 years of marriage. I shifted my position to see more of the room without being spotted. There, near the kitchen doorway, Percy stood with a beer in his hand, nodding at some story being told by a man wearing my old reading glasses. My backup pair I'd left on the kitchen counter. My son looked relaxed, comfortable, completely at home, hosting a party in his father's house during his father's absence. Linda appeared from the direction of my study, carrying what looked like photo albums. She was dressed up, hair styled, makeup perfect, wearing the kind of party outfit that required advanced planning. This wasn't spontaneous. This had been organized, prepared for, anticipated. I watched her laugh at something Percy said, watched her gesture expansively around my living room, as if showing off her own space to new friends. The easy confidence in her movement, the proprietary way she straightened cushions and directed traffic flow. This was a woman who felt completely entitled to everything she was doing. The front door was heavy oak, original to the house, with a brass handle that had developed a slight squeak over the years. I'd been meaning to oil those hinges, but now I found myself grateful for the warning sound it would make. I wanted them to know I was coming. My reflection stared back at me from the glass panel beside the door. A man returning from vacation to find his home invaded, his hospitality abused, his family's true feelings finally displayed without pretense. The Florida sun had given me color, but more importantly, the week with Rufus had given me clarity. I thought of his words on our last morning. Emmy, the moment you walk back into that house, you'll have a choice. You can keep being the man they expect you to be, or you can be the man you actually are. Choose carefully. Behind the door, someone laughed loudly at a joke I couldn't hear. Music pulsed through the walls of the house I'd worked 30 years to pay for, filled with people who saw it as nothing more than a convenient party venue. Percy and Linda had turned my sanctuary into their social club, my absence into their opportunity. I adjusted my grip on the suitcase handle and reached for the door. Through the glass, I could see part of the chaos waiting for me. My chaos, my house, my family, my choice about what happened next. The brass handle turned easily under my palm, well maintained despite its age. The door swung open on its slightly protesting hinges, and I stepped across the threshold into my own home. The music hit me first, then the smell of unfamiliar food and strangers' cologne. Voices carried from the living room, casual conversations among people who had no idea they were about to meet the homeowner they'd never been told about. I set my suitcase down carefully on the hardwood floor and removed my jacket with deliberate movements. Through the foyer archway, I could see the full scope of their presumption. My house had been transformed into their playground, and they were all completely, blissfully unaware that the game was about to end. The living room fell silent in waves, like dominoes of recognition toppling from those facing the entrance toward the back of the room. I stood perfectly still in my own foyer, letting them absorb my presence while I cataloged the damage to my sanctuary. My great-grandfather's reading chair had been pushed against the wall to make dancing space. Someone had used my mother's china as party plates, leaving crumbs and wine stains on pieces that had survived 3 generations of careful handling. The family photographs on my mantelpiece had been turned face down to make room for bottles and party favors. Interesting. I let my voice carry just enough to cut through the awkward silence. And I thought this was my house. Linda's wine glass froze halfway to her lips, her face cycling through expressions like a broken television. Surprise, panic, forced brightness. She had been mid-laugh when she spotted me, and the sound died in her throat like something poisoned. Emmy! Her voice pitched higher than usual, nervous energy making her words tumble together. You came back early. We weren't expecting your flight. Percy appeared from behind a cluster of guests, beer bottle dangling from his fingers. His face held the confused expression of someone trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces. He looked between Linda and me, his mouth opening without sound, like a fish pulled suddenly from water. A woman I'd never seen before, wearing my reading glasses and holding one of my books, looked around the room with growing awareness. Who is this guy? The question hung in the air like smoke. Several guests began reaching for purses and jackets, their party mood evaporating as they recognized the shift in atmospheric pressure. The man by my stereo finally had the sense to turn off the music, leaving only the sound of uncomfortable shuffling and nervous breathing. I walked further into my living room, moving with the deliberate calm I'd learned from Rufus's military bearing. Each step revealed new violations. My coffee table scratched from careless bottle placement, my carpet stained with something red that definitely wasn't wine, my privacy invaded by strangers who had no business in my space. Percy, I kept my tone level, conversational. Would you mind explaining why my house is full of people I've never met? My son's face flushed the color of his beer bottle. Dad, Linda said, we thought you'd be gone longer, Linda finished, recovering enough to attempt damage control. Her voice carried that familiar manipulative sweetness, the tone she used when caught doing something she couldn't quite deny. It was just a small gathering. Neighbors, my work friends. I surveyed the room again, counting faces. 12 strangers in my living room, not including Percy and Linda. Food and drinks scattered across every surface. Furniture rearranged to accommodate people who had no right to rearrange it. Small gathering, I repeated, letting the words settle. In my house, using my things, without my knowledge or permission. One of the guests, a middle-aged man wearing an expensive suit, cleared his throat. Maybe we should go, Linda. This seems like family business. Linda's eyes flashed with something between anger and desperation. She had been caught, exposed, her careful manipulation laid bare in front of witnesses. The woman who had spent 3 years slowly claiming my space as her own now faced the owner's unexpected return. Now might be good, I agreed, looking directly at the suited man. I appreciate your understanding. The exodus began immediately. Guests gathered belongings with the efficiency of people who recognized an uncomfortable situation and wanted no part of its resolution. Coats appeared from closets I hadn't known were being used. Purses materialized from hiding places throughout my house. Within minutes, only family remained. Percy stood frozen near the window, his beer untouched, his face a map of conflicting loyalties. Linda positioned herself beside the mantelpiece, using its height advantage like a general commanding high ground. The house fell completely silent for the first time in what was clearly hours. No music, no laughter, no comfortable party chatter. Just three people in a room full of evidence, with nowhere left to hide. The last few guests whispered their goodbyes and slipped out the front door like smoke escaping a burning building. One woman left her half-empty wine glass on my mantelpiece. A man, in an expensive jacket, grabbed what looked like someone else's coat from my closet. Nobody made eye contact as they filed past me. Their party mood evaporated into the kind of awkward silence that follows public humiliation. Linda stood in the center of my living room, wine glass trembling in her manicured fingers. The party dress she'd chosen so carefully now looked wrinkled and desperate under my living room lights. Her breathing came in short, sharp bursts as she watched her carefully constructed evening collapse around her. Percy had abandoned his beer on the coffee table and now stood frozen between us, his face cycling through expressions I'd never seen before: confusion, horror, the slow dawn of recognition that maybe his father hadn't been unreasonable all these years. "How dare you ruin my party?" Linda's voice cracked on the last word, wine and panic making her reckless. She moved toward me with quick, aggressive steps, her wine glass forgotten and abandoned on the nearest surface. I could see the exact moment when her usual manipulative tactics failed her, when charm and tears and strategic victimhood wouldn't work anymore. What remained was raw desperation and 3 years of accumulated entitlement. Her hand came up fast, connecting with my cheek with a sharp crack that echoed through the suddenly quiet house. The slap stung, but not as much as 3 years of accumulated disrespect had stung. I felt my head turn slightly with the force, felt the heat bloom across my cheekbone. "Linda!" Percy's voice carried shock and horror I'd never heard before. "Have you lost your mind?" For the first time in 3 years, my son was defending me instead of her. The irony wasn't lost on me that it took his wife hitting his father to wake him up to what had been happening all along. I touched my cheek with deliberate calm, feeling the warm spot where her palm had connected. The sensation was almost clinical, like examining evidence of a crime already solved. Interesting. The single word dropped into the silence like a stone into still water. Not anger, not hurt. Not the wounded confusion Linda had probably expected. Just cold, analytical observation from a man who had finally seen enough. Linda's face went white as she realized what she'd done. The wine buzz evaporated instantly, replaced by the kind of clarity that comes too late to prevent disaster. She had just physically assaulted me in front of witnesses, had revealed her true nature in the most undeniable way possible. Percy stared at his wife as if seeing her for the first time. His mouth opened without sound, his hand half raised toward her before dropping to his side. The man who had spent 3 years automatically taking her side now looked at her like she was a stranger who had wandered into his house and attacked his father. The front door closed behind the final guest with a soft click, leaving us alone with the wreckage of more than just a party. The silence stretched between us, broken only by Linda's ragged breathing and the distant hum of the refrigerator in my kitchen. Linda's wine glass sat abandoned on my coffee table, leaving a ring on the wood that Margaret and I had chosen together 30 years ago. The mark would probably be permanent, like everything else that had happened tonight. I straightened my shoulders and looked at both of them, my son and his wife, the people I had sheltered and supported and enabled for 3 years. The people who had just shown me exactly what my kindness had purchased. "Interesting," I repeated, my voice carrying the weight of every insult absorbed, every manipulation endured, every moment of disrespect I had swallowed in the name of family peace. The reckoning had begun. Percy took a step toward me, his face still etched with shock at what his wife had done. "Dad, I never knew she—" His words trailed off as he struggled to process the violence he'd just witnessed. Linda remained frozen where she'd struck me, her hand still tingling from the slap. I could see the exact moment when the reality of her situation hit her, when she understood that her comfortable world was crashing down around her perfectly styled hair. "By tomorrow evening," I said, my voice calm as morning coffee, "I don't want to see you here." The words landed with the finality of a judge's gavel, not shouted, not dramatic, just stated as simple fact. 24 hours to pack up 3 years of accumulated presumption and find somewhere else to live. Linda's knees buckled. She sank to my hardwood floor in her party dress, wine stains and mascara, creating abstract art on fabric that had cost more than most people's monthly groceries. "Emmy, forgive me. I didn't mean to. Please, I was just... the wine. I wasn't thinking..." Her sobs echoed off the walls that had witnessed 3 years of her systematic disrespect. Real tears this time, born of genuine panic rather than calculated manipulation. She had finally pushed too far, revealed too much, destroyed the careful balance that had kept her secure. "Dad, please, think about this." Percy moved between us, his instincts still pulling him toward peacekeeping, despite what he'd just seen. "She's upset. She made a mistake. But surely we can..." "I've been thinking for 68 years, I interrupted, looking directly at my son. "Enough." The finality in those 2 words stopped Percy mid-sentence. He'd never heard that tone from me before, never seen this version of his father, who refused to be moved by tears or pleas or the familiar dance of family obligation. Linda crawled closer on her knees, reaching for my hands with desperation that would have worked on the old me. "Please, Emmy, don't do this. Where will we go? We don't have anywhere. We don't have anything." The truth of that statement hung in the air between us. They had nothing because they had never built anything, had never saved anything, had never planned for a future that didn't include my unlimited generosity. They had lived like trust fund children in a house they didn't own, supported by a man they had systematically diminished. "You should have thought of that before," I said, stepping away from her reaching hands. "Before the coffee complaints and the party planning and the complete lack of gratitude for every single thing I've provided." Percy's face crumpled as the pattern finally became clear to him. All those mornings when he'd automatically sided with Linda. All those moments when he'd made me apologize for existing in my own space. The enabling and the excuses and the 3 years of watching his father shrink to accommodate his wife's expanding entitlement. "Dad, I'm so sorry," he whispered. "I didn't realize... I should have seen." But apologies wouldn't rebuild 3 years of eroded respect. They wouldn't restore the authority I'd surrendered one small compromise at a time. They wouldn't give me back the peace I'd lost, trying to keep everyone else comfortable. Linda's sobs grew louder, more desperate. She pressed her face to my hardwood floor like a supplicant before an altar, her party makeup leaving stains on the wood I'd have to clean tomorrow. After they were gone, I turned toward the staircase, my business here finished. The man who would have spent hours explaining and justifying and apologizing was gone, replaced by someone who understood that boundaries without consequences were just suggestions. My footsteps on the stairs sounded different somehow, more solid, more certain, like the footsteps of a man walking through his own house instead of tiptoeing through someone else's temper tantrum. Behind me, I could hear Percy trying to comfort his sobbing wife, trying to make sense of a world where his father had finally stopped being convenient. But that was their problem now, not mine. Tomorrow they would leave, and I would have my house back. Morning sunlight streamed through my bedroom windows, warming skin that had slept peacefully for the first time in 3 years. I'd awaken naturally at 6:30, no sound of arguments or demands from downstairs, no anxiety about what fresh crisis awaited me in my own kitchen. Percy and Linda's bedroom door remained closed as I dressed in my best navy suit, the one Margaret had picked out for important occasions. Today felt important. Today felt like the beginning of something that should have started years ago. The bus to downtown Chicago carried me through neighborhoods where people minded their own business and paid their own bills. The notary's office occupied the 3rd floor of a limestone building that had housed professional services since before I was born. Solid, reliable. Unlike some people I could mention, Margaret Walsh had been handling my legal documents for 15 years, ever since her father retired from the same practice. Her office walls displayed diplomas and certificates that spoke of competence earned rather than assumed. She looked up from the papers spread across her mahogany desk as I entered. "Mr. Spencer, the will modification you requested is ready for signature." Her voice carried the professional neutrality of someone who'd seen enough family drama to remain diplomatically silent about personal decisions. The document lay before me, crisp legal language translating my intentions into binding reality. My house, my savings, my carefully accumulated assets would flow to organizations that actually serve people instead of exploiting them. Unless, of course, my family could demonstrate sustained gratitude and respect over the coming year. "Are you certain about this decision?" Margaret asked, legally required to confirm my competence and intent. I thought of Linda's slap, still tingling faintly on my cheek, of Percy's shocked face when he finally saw his wife's true nature, of 3 years spent apologizing for existing in my own home. Absolutely, gratitude cannot be bought, but it can be taught. My signature flowed across the page with the same smooth confidence I'd felt walking down my stairs this morning. The notary's seal pressed into the paper with a satisfying thunk, making my new boundaries legally permanent. The bus ride home carried me through the same neighborhoods, but everything looked different now, sharper, more clearly defined, like someone had adjusted the focus on a camera that had been blurry for years. My key turned in my front door lock with the familiar resistance that meant home. The house stood empty and quiet, no party debris or uninvited guests or family members who treated my generosity like an entitlement program. Just clean rooms and organized spaces and the kind of peace that comes from being master of your own domain. I made coffee in my own kitchen, using my own coffee maker, drinking from my own mug. The newspaper lay folded beside my breakfast plate, headlines about other people's problems that weren't mine to solve. The morning sun illuminated dust motes dancing in air that smelled like coffee and possibility instead of resentment and obligation. From my favorite chair, the leather recliner that had been my father's before me, I could see the entire living room return to its proper order. No evidence of last night's invasion remained, except for one faint water ring on the coffee table where Linda's wine glass had sat. That mark would stay there, I decided, a small reminder of the cost of taking kindness for granted. The house settled around me with contented creaks, like a building finally able to exhale after holding its breath too long. Somewhere across town, Percy and Linda were probably packing belongings and making phone calls, learning what the world looked like when you couldn't rely on someone else's unconditional support. They would figure it out eventually. People usually did when they had no choice. I turned the page of my newspaper and sipped my coffee. Master of my own domain at last. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left. Thank you for watching.